Hey art nerds! Today we're taking a look at Kuretake's Cambio Tambien, their new-ish pigment-based brush pens that utilize colored pigments. So I purchased these off of Dick Blick. Those of you who watch my channel probably know that I'm a big fan of Pentel's pigment brush pens, and I was really excited to see that there were colorful versions on the market, although by Kuretake, not by Pentel. Now, that's no slight. I really like Kuretake as well, and I've been reviewing their products over on the blog for a long time. So here are the Pentel pigment brush pens. They're only available in black, although Pentel makes dye-based brush pens in other colors, and they have a squishy gray body that allows you to advance the ink, and refills are available. So although the Cambio Tambien are available in sets, I purchased them open stock on Blick so that I could get the colors that I wanted, and they're pretty pricey. So they are $7.84 open stock on Blick, or $44.69 for a set of 6, and there are 2 sets available, set A and set B. There are 12 total colors, including black, reminiscent of the 12 color watercolor palettes that are pretty common. You've seen me review a bunch of them. While color selection is limited, it also seems thoughtful and intentional. These are all colors that would work well for inking illustrations. And each set is available for $44.69 on Amazon as well, and I'll have links as well as a transcript down in the description below. On the back of the plastic package is instructions on how to get your pens started. And the Kuretake site refers to these as subdued tones inspired by traditional Japanese aesthetics. And these correspond with the colors in their Gansai Tambi palette. I'll link that in the description as well. If you guys are interested in seeing me use these with my Gansai Tambi palette, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to do it. I just want to know if there's interest. And the Kuretake site has a lot of inspiration for you guys to check out. So these aren't just intended for calligraphers, they're intended for artists and illustrators as well. So these have a hard color-coded body with English and Japanese on the body, and the English name as well as Cambio Tambien is on the body, so it's a little bit easier to pick your colors, although you've got a whole color-coded body to help you with that. And usually with brush pens, you can kind of squish the body to get the ink to flow. That's not the case with these. They are a hard body. They also have a very unusual feed mechanism, and it's the first time I've seen this. It's a brush tip, but it has a wick rather than free-floating ink. This might keep the ink from evaporating out of the pen body. Ink flow might be an issue with these. We're going to examine that a little bit later on. So you can see the squishier body here on the Pentel pigment brush pen. And the Pentel pigment brush pen is actually what really turned me on to the idea of pigment-based brush pens, because the Pentel pigment brush pens are waterproof or water resistant once they've had a chance to dry. So I'm going to finish getting these kind of prepped, ready, getting their ink flow moving. And I'm going to store them upside down in a cup so that the ink can actually reach the brush tip. It took a really long time for the pigment ink to reach the brush, like multiple hours. I cut all that out, don't worry. And there's no real way to accelerate this. That really weird wick limits the ink flow. So it took about 2 days to actually get the ink all the way to the tip of the brush pen. And in between, I did do some scrubbing of the brush just to kind of help accelerate the ink flow. So fans of my channel probably know that I love inking and I love watercolor. I'm a watercolor comic artist, and you guys can check out my comic for free at 7inchcara.com. It's entirely in watercolor. So when I'm buying art supplies, I'm usually looking to see if it's water resistant and if it's alcohol marker resistant, particularly with inking supplies. This is really important to me. So it's important that we test that, and I'm going to be testing that today in a Canson mixed media sketchbook. And I want to point out that this channel sees no outside sponsorship. This was not sponsored by Kuretake. It was not sponsored by Blick. These were not sent to me for the purposes of review. These were purchased by me because I like pigment brush pens, and I was really excited to see some colorful options on the market. I reviewed the Akashia thin line, and I really like those. And I've also got the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens, and I use those all the time, and I was looking for some larger color brush pens to utilize in my illustration. So if you like the work I do, if you enjoy my reviews and my tutorials, one of the ways you can help me continue to do so is by joining me on Patreon. You can find out more information at patreon.com/natosoup, and I'll get you early access to videos like this one. So with the Cambio Tambien, once you get these things going, they're actually pretty juicy, and the ink flow seems able to keep up with my movements. I'm doing these kind of variated lines to see whether we get dry brushing or if they start railroading or running out, and they seem to be able to keep up. They have some really nice colors, although not quite what the barrel indicates, particularly with the ultramarine blue. It's kind of more of a phthalo blue. It's a cooler blue. The pigments used in these brush pens seem to be very finely milled, or maybe even India ink, because I'm not really getting a lot of granulation or sedimentation. Now, I have mixed feelings about that. I love granulation and sedimentation, but on smaller art pieces, it can appear muddy, and this would make it a little bit easier to control. So the colors I purchased were Quin Magenta Yellow Ochre, Indigo Sap Green, Burnt Sienna, and Ultramarine. And that is in the order that I just read them. The yellow ochre is also a little bit more of like a sunshine yellow than a true yellow ochre. So on the note of pigment inks, I was on a real Sailor Storia kick for a while. I actually really love Sailor Storia inks. I love using them in my fountain pens. I've had a lot of positive things to say about them here on YouTube and over on the blog, and even on my secret fountain pen tumbler that I keep with a friend. So I was kind of hoping for something more like Sailor Storia, and I'm pretty interested in maybe making my own brush pens with Sailor Storia ink, but evaporation is definitely an issue I want to consider. So I allowed these to dry fully overnight, and now I'm testing them out with alcohol and water. So I'm using a Blick Studio brush alcohol marker to see if they reactivate, if we get any smearing, if we get any movement. And I'm applying the color on top. This could be a great way to tint your line art further, or you could line on top of an existing marker or watercolor illustration. These have some really fun possibilities. They seem to be alcohol marker and water resistant, which is great. It's ideal for my purposes, and you guys will see that in just a second when I apply some core watercolor on top. These are the qualities that I'm usually looking for when I'm looking at brush pens at this point. There's a lot of water-based, water-soluble brush pens on the market. There's a lot of dye-based brush pens on the market, and I have a few of those. I really like the Pentel dye-based brush pens, and the Mermaid Markers aren't bad either, but I'm not looking to acquire more of those. I'm looking to acquire more marker and waterproof inking possibilities. So I was thinking that these could be used as a watercolor, like applied to a mat and then painted on. So like I have a Teflon surface that I've applied to my desk, and I could apply the pigment to the Teflon surface and then pick it up with a wet brush and then paint with it. And that would be something that's fun to test in the future. So speaking of test, I have a full field test here in this video, and I hope you guys will enjoy it. So I have here this illustration of Kara hiding under a leaf during a rainstorm. I've been having so much fun doing stop motion animation in these videos. If you guys like it, let me know down in the comments. So the first part of this field test, I'm going to ink this piece using these brush pens since they are brush pens. And since I bought color brush pens, I'm going to try and pick colors that coordinate with what I'm actually inking. So I found these to be kind of difficult to control while I was inking. They tend to get very drippy and very blobby. I don't think it's necessarily the heat of my hand in this instance. In some instances, the heat of your hand makes the ink inside the pen expand, like with the Kuretake Fudenosuke. If you're inking on a hot day, it's going to tend to be very blobby. I'm not so sure that's what's going on here. It has a wick, and you would think the wick would help control that. And it's not like I can just squeeze the barrel and get the ink to accelerate. I had a lot of control issues, so what I ended up doing is I would ink for a while, and then when it started getting drippy and difficult to control, I would invert the pen so that the brush is at the top and set it in a jar for a few seconds and then go back to inking, which makes this process very time consuming. More time consuming than, say, with the Pentel Pigment Brushpen or with Tombow Fudenosuke Brushpens or basically any other contained brush pen I've used, save for, say, a water brush with acrylic ink. I don't know if that's a user error on my end. Maybe they have something going on with barometric pressure where the more you squeeze them, the more ink it releases. If any of you guys happen to know, please let me know in the comments because I do like these pens in general. That is the biggest flaw that I had with these pens, and if I could better control them, I would like them a lot better. So I'm inking on fluid cellulose watercolor paper. It's 140 pound. I removed it from a block and ran it through my printer and then penciled on top of it. And it's a heavy duty paper, so it's not like there's any sort of resist. It should be able to take this kind of ink without a problem. Because these pens are so drippy, they're so wet, the ink just kind of sat on the paper surface. So to prevent smearing and to prevent like it getting all over my hands and then getting all over the place, I had to take a lot of breaks. So that combined with the fact that these are very drippy and they have to be inverted made inking this take a little bit longer than usual. It wasn't a particularly long piece to ink, so I'm not like, oh, it took hours and hours. Nothing like that. But I'm used to inking quickly using a blotter sheet, as you guys see here. And that sort of consideration does kind of limit how and when I can use these brush pens. One of the things I love about brush pens is I can throw them in my bag and ink almost anywhere. I've inked at so many conventions. I've done October inking challenges at Handmade & Bound, which was an outside zine festival. I've done inking, I've worked on October inking challenges while on camping trips. I've inked on planes, which is not a good idea. So I like the portability that brush pens have to offer, and the fact that these are very prone to dripping and you need a lot of breaks, and you need to give the paper a chance to absorb it is kind of a limiting factor. Again, this could be user error. It could be something I'm doing wrong that I'm not aware of. So I am definitely open to your suggestions down in the comments below. So one of the problems with these being so juicy is that inking smaller areas like her little bitty fingers is much more challenging because the ink tends to blob and you don't get as many nuanced lines. Now, one of the problems is maybe I'm working too small. This is actually a larger illustration for me, but maybe I should be working even larger. Since these are designed to coordinate with the shoot. My brain lost it. Oh my god. Gensai Tambien paints. There we go. I don't know why my brain was like Casio. You're looking for the word Casio. Gensai Tambien paints. Maybe they're meant to be more of a sketchy sort of tool or something that you do really large brush strokes with, something like that. Now, the Kuretake site has some really gorgeous art created with these. In fact, some of it is like graphic style art like you would see with Poscas, and I'm super inspired by that and I want to try doing it myself. with some of the pieces that feature watercolor, it was difficult for me to tell how these pins came into play, whether they were being applied to another surface and then painted on to that paper, or if they were used for the line art or what. I couldn't quite tell, and the Kuretake site didn't really explain what they meant. So something else that's interesting about these is you do get a slight shading effect, sort of like what you would get with Sailor Storia's Lion, where areas with a lighter application are lighter and areas with a darker application are darker. And this would be really great if I could control that ink flow. So what I'm doing now is I'm just kind of going back over some areas and adding a darker color of ink. So for example, on the leaves, on the undersides of the leaves, I added a layer of indigo just to kind of add some shading. Now here's where I make kind of a mistake. I decided to go ahead and ink the frame of the oval. I should have just left that uninked. The end piece would have looked better, but you know. All right, so here is the inked illustration. Next up, I need to erase the pencil lines underneath. So I'm using a white eraser and I have an eraser brush, and I found that these erased with no problem. There were no issues with ghosting and only slight issues with it lifting up onto the eraser. So as long as you're working with a fairly gentle eraser, maybe not a pink pearl eraser, you should be good with these. You can see a little bit of the color pickup here. That's not normally something I notice when I'm erasing like black pigment, but that could also just be staining. So I tried to use all of the Cambio Tambien. Sorry, y'all. My brain keeps wanting to say Casio. I used all of the Cambio Tambiens that I owned. There are 12. There are some additional colors that it'd be nice to have, like maybe the purple and maybe the Scarlet Lake. But don't feel like you have to have all of them. So next, we are doing a watercolor field test. And I'm doing it from start to finish with you guys. And that means this thing, I mean, most of this video has been time-lapse to some extent. Some parts are more time-lapse than others, just for time considerations. But the main meat of the watercolor has been time-lapse significantly. It took me a couple of days to paint the finished illustration. So be patient with yourself. One of the things that always kind of breaks my heart is I teach, and when I hear my students complain or lament that they are too slow, quote unquote, too slow. So I always try to make it a point to point out when I'm time-lapsing my videos, because I want to normalize it taking as long as it's going to take. And for this illustration, I am not using the Kuretake Gensai Tombow palette. That would have been ideal for this. Next time. Again, let me know down in the comments if you want to see me use the destined, fated pair together. I'd be happy to do that. I just got to hear back from you guys. But I am using my Daily Driver watercolor palette. And one of the first things I'm doing is I'm applying a little bit of Winsor Newton dyed masking fluid to mask out the droplets. And it's in a tiny dinky dip cup because I found out that if you open and close, open and close, open and close your masking fluid, it evaporates, causes it to spoil faster, and yes, masking fluid being a latex-based product does spoil, and boy, you think it stinks fresh. It really stinks when it's spoiled. It's nasty. And then you can't really use it because it's latex, and latex does rot. But if you use it in a smaller container like this, and you're not constantly opening your bottle, it lasts a lot longer and less goes to waste. So I've been pouring it into a little dinky dip so that I'm wasting less masking fluid. You don't have to use a dinky dip. You could use one of those paint pots like for models. So after my masking fluid had a chance to dry, I'm applying an all-over application of a little bit of Payne's Gray mixed with some Ultramarine blue. And if these inks were gonna smear, now would be the time, because I put on so much water. Actually, for this field test, I applied so much water, I applied so many different effects, I put on masking fluid, I removed masking fluid. If it was going to have problems with watercolor, this field test would have been a great indication. It's also on a cellulose paper, which doesn't always perform as well as a cotton rag paper. However, again, spoiler, I actually didn't have any issues with these brush pens in terms of handling, in terms of application. They play really well with watercolor. I would like to do another field test where I try them out with alcohol markers at a later date. I didn't want to mix the two field tests. I wanted to keep it a cohesive individual field test. So I hope you guys will let me know. Again, another thing I'm asking you to do, let me know in the comments if you guys would be interested in an alcohol marker field test / demonstration / tutorial with these brush pens, and if you guys would check that out. So for this illustration, I'm trying to capture kind of like a sudden summery thunderstorm. It's actually late fall here, but it's Louisiana, so it's 68, so it's not cold at all. And hurricane season basically lasts as long as it's warm. So I wanted to introduce some texture, some grittiness, some interest into the sky and the background leaves, so I sprinkled in a little bit of salt. When I'm applying salt to watercolor illustrations, I like using kosher salt because you get those big granules and you get those big salt snowflakes. Of course, when you apply salt, you have to be really careful to remove all of it before you paint on top of it. Now, my method for removing salt is I first use a drafting brush just to kind of sweep it off, and then I go over it and kind of pick at the rest with my nail to make sure I get rid of as much of the salt as possible. When applying salt, you also want to make sure you're not just putting it, sometimes you can't help it, it is salt, but you want to try and put it on areas that are still damp, but not pooled water. If it's a pool of water, that salt is not going to do hardly anything. And if it's basically dry, that salt is not going to do anything. It's kind of like Goldilocks. You got to find the just right sweet spot. So I'm applying multiple layers of indigo and Payne's gray to try and build up this atmospheric color, this dark sky. You would think Caro would be a little bit more frightened considering, but I guess my Lilliputian girl just has no fear. And then I'm going in with a cool yellow and I'm painting some of the foreground leaves to make them pop. Now, spoiler again, this does get kind of lost in the full illustration. And also, spoiler, I kind of feel like I overworked this piece and it would be really fun to go back and redo it with a lighter hand, focusing more on mood and atmosphere and less on, say, local color or rendering the thing to death. However, other than for the field test, I'm painting it for fun, and sometimes you learn the most by making mistakes. And I can't say that this piece turned out bad in the end. I can't say I don't like it. All I can say is that watching the video, there's definitely some things that I'd like to try or do differently in future pieces. So once our yellow had a chance to dry, I'm painting in some indigo shadows. I'm using the indigo to paint in shadows on the foreground leaves, but also to push the background leaves a little bit further back into the distance and to create some shadow. We've basically done kind of a very lazy grisé effect with this because the underpainting is done in Payne's gray. And what that's going to do is it's going to help tone and coordinate some of the colors that go on top of it. So if you wanted to, let's say you're painting someone who's underwater and they're swimming and you're like me and you over-render everything, then what I would recommend, what I've done in the past and have had success with it, is I paint my green or my blue tones first and then I paint my skin tones on top of that. Because if you paint the grays or the blues or the greens on top of skin tones, it tends to neutralize it way too much. So here's where I kind of killed it. The first part, I kind of killed it. And I don't mean killed it in like I knocked it out of the park, but killed it like I had some really good things going, and then I beat them over the head with a baseball bat. Yeah, kind of overkill. So I am applying Hooker's Green. It's Daniel Smith Hooker's Green to my foreground leaves. Now the problem with Hooker's green, it's a beautiful green. It's a great green. But in terms of foliage in my art, it tends to look dead and lazy. A better green would have been if I mixed a phthalo blue with a cool yellow. That would have given us a much more vibrant green, or allowed your eyes to mix a green on the paper by applying layers of yellow and layers of blue. You know, sometimes you know better and you ignore that knowing better to do it your own way. And using Hooker's green for foliage is not always bad. As you can see here, I had such a nice thing going with that yellow, and then applying that green on top of it just kind of killed it. And then I really went into it with some indigo on top of it, and that just really darkens everything so much. Even if I had just left the leaf that Kara's holding a brighter shade of green with more yellow in it, that would have drawn the interest. I mean, to be fair, Kara is already going to kind of pop out. I utilize contrasting colors to help make her pop out in this image, as you'll see in a minute. But that bright yellow leaf would have also reflected her bright, sunny personality. But you know, it's so easy to critique your own work when you're watching it in time-lapse and narrating on top of it. So I'm also going in and adding a much thicker mix of indigo, wet into wet, in the shadows of the leaves in the background. I'm trying to bring in more texture. I'm trying to bring in more interest. I'm trying to keep everything from looking just flatty flat, which is something my art has definitely looked like in the past, and it's something I'm working on improving. So, you know, now that I've bludgeoned the leaves into submission, it's time for me to add some color to Kara. So I mix yellow ochre with scarlet to get kind of a peachy skin tone. This is kind of my default Caucasian skin tone. And I add more or less yellow ochre or scarlet depending on the needs for that. But if you're interested in learning how to mix skin tones beyond just, you know, white people's skin tones or very light people's skin tones, I have a video. Actually, I did a live stream on it, and then I did a tutorial on it that you guys can check out. I'll link them in the cards, and I'll also link them in the description below. I have a lot of really great watercolor tutorials here on this channel that I hope you guys will check out, and I hope you guys will enjoy them, and let me know what you think. If there's ever something you can't find on this channel and you'd like to see me handle it or talk about it, I'm always want to hear from you guys, so let me know in the comments below or reach out to me on my Discord server, The Paint Box. There will be a link for that in the description as well. So at this point, I'm gonna keep going back into the leaves and adding more and more and more and more. So let's talk about the brushes that I'm using. I am mostly using silver black velvet brushes. Now normally I love these things. They are a mix of squirrel and synthetic, which if you have ethical problems with using squirrel, I understand, I respect that. These are not for you. They do use squirrel, but they are more affordable than, you know, purely squirrel brushes, but they perform much better than many synthetic brushes. So for Kara's dress, it is a mix of Holbein Cherry Red and Magello Compost Rose, I want to say. I wanted something that wasn't like too bright and popish. Now, one of the problems with this is that, and I have to remember, I have to remind myself, girl, you are painting on cellulose, and cellulose has unique problems, and Fluid Easy Block performed quite admirably because I was basically treating it like I would treat a cotton rag. I kind of forgot myself, and it really held up to the task, so I really should not complain too much. But I ended up goofing the dress, and you'll see that in a minute. So at this point, I want to start painting in some of the dewdrops. So I'm using a masking fluid eraser, a masking fluid pickup, a rubber cement eraser. You will find it by many names. You will also find it linked in the description below to pick up my masking fluid. Now, some people use their fingers and just kind of scratchy scratch on the paper. I've never really had any luck with that. I don't know. My hands are super dry, so maybe that's why. But this thing, it's like a magnet for masking fluid. It just wants to pick it up. So I would recommend using this I've had 2 in the 10 years that I've been using masking fluid. I recently got the newer one because I misplaced the older one when I moved, and then I found the older one. So they're like a $3 investment, and they last forever. And if you need it in smaller chunks, you can always cut it. I think it's actually made from like rubber cement boogers. Anyway, it works really well for picking up masking fluid, and I did not have any issues with tearing. So on that note, what's y'all's favorite masking fluid? I feel like every artist is as specific about their preferred masking fluid as they are about their preferred paint. So I felt like the dewdrops were like very white, so I spritzed them with water to get the paint kind of moving, and then I flicked Payne's gray on top of it to kind of get this like speckled pattern, just kind of add in some interest. And see, I actually like the bleeding I got on the dress here. I think it adds to the atmosphere, it makes it less stiff, it makes it feel more like she's in this kind of rainy environment. That's not what I meant by goofing her dress. We've yet to get to that. So at this point, I want to add some blush to her cheeks and lips. So I'm using Holbein's Cherry Red for this. And their Cherry Red is just a quinacridone red. But it's a really nice pinkish red color. Can be a little too saturated sometimes. Aha! Here is the goof. Okay, so the goof is I wanted to paint shadows on her dress, and I went too dark. The mix has too much dioxine purple and not enough naphthalide red. I should have just done naphthalide red or even ultramarine like I was originally thinking. That is the goof. And some of you guys are probably watching and you're like, I don't really understand what's so wrong with it. So I went too dark and now it looks muddy is what's wrong with it. So I'm also going in and I am painting the dewdrops. And the first thing with the dewdrops is I'm painting in a little bit of local color, so whatever's kind of around them. So for example, for the dewdrops on the leaves, I'm using some very watered down Hooker's green. For the dewdrops that are, not dewdrops, raindrops that are in front of Kara's dress, I'm using a little bit of the watered down base dress color, etc. And that's because raindrops are, they're transparent, but they also reflect light and they also reflect shadow. So it kind of captures both of those. And then once that's dried, I'm going to go over it with a very light wash or a very light application of Payne's Gray to kind of paint in the shadow of our dewdrops. Now here is the second goof I did on that dress. I wanted to add a surface pattern because sometimes you can salvage bad shading with a good surface design. And I decided I was going to do a large plaid because she's a 7-inch tall girl, and when I do fabrics on Kara, if I do patterns, I do really large patterns to indicate her size. And, you know, it just didn't really work out this time. Sometimes it works out well, sometimes it doesn't work out well. This is one of those times where it kind of just looks scratchy and muddy. But art, as in life, you win some, you lose some, and sometimes it's through those losses that you learn the most along the way. So, as I mentioned earlier, I have more tutorials where I talk more in depth about painting people. I also have more tutorials where I talk more in depth about painting Kara herself. So if you're interested in how I handle faces, how I handle like the contours of the face, or how I paint hair in more detail, I highly recommend you check out some of the tutorials that I'm going to link down below, and I'm going to link in the cards. So once I have the basics of her face painted, I went into her mouth and I applied a layer of Cherry Red just kind of as a base color. And then I started painting her hair with a very watered down wash of Venetian Red. This is going to allow me to create some highlights later on once it has a chance to dry. And those of you who have watched a lot of my watercolor tutorials or some of my watercolor comic tutorials know that I usually save painting in the hair for basically the end. That's like one of the last things I do when I'm painting a Cara page is I'll paint Cara's hair, or I'll paint Meldina's hair, or I'll paint Naomi's hair, because those tend to have, they're the most saturated. So when I'm doing watercolor illustrations, and I haven't talked about this in a while, I think about the fat over lean principle in watercolor. So lean would be a very light wash, a wash that doesn't have a lot of pigment in it, whereas quote unquote fat would be like almost straight from the pan. I'm not going to apply any layers or any glazes on top of that. So when I'm painting her hair, it's a very saturated mix. As you guys can see, I'm just basically going directly to the pan. So anyway, the watercolor part of this field test is finished. So now I've pulled out some of my favorite watercolor pencils to add in some details and to help clean things up a bit. Sometimes when I have a piece that I'm kind of mediocre on, I can go in with watercolor pencils and really make it sing. So these are actually a good little selection of some of my favorite watercolor pencils, especially those that I have reviewed here on this channel. And I know someone's already thinking, their typing fingers are about to say, hey, Inktenses aren't watercolor pencils, they're India ink. So there, now you don't have to type it, I said it for you. Yeah, there's a lot of Derwent Inktense right there. They are technically not watercolor pencils, but a lot of the watercolor pencils that are on the market actually use India inks, and Derwent Inktense is the one that actually admits to it. So like Faber-Castell's Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils, those use India inks. So those are technically not watercolor pencils either. But we're not here to talk about technicalities. We're here to talk about adding details with watercolor pencils. And when I'm doing watercolor, and I'm going to use watercolor pencils for details, I really like to work on a watercolor paper that has a good amount of tooth so that we actually get some watercolor pencil on the paper. So mostly with this, I am using colors that can add highlights. So I have a cool yellow to add highlights to the leaves. I have a white to add highlights to basically everything, especially the dewdrops, and also draw in some rain in the background. And see, that is the other big mistake that I ended up making, is I ended up overworking this, making it too busy. So there's a lot of visual white noise that kind of deadens the piece. You start losing some of the contrast, you start losing some of the shadows, and it just all kind of becomes white noisy. So when I finished with the watercolor pencils, I grabbed my tube of white gouache, and I'm using that to add in some white highlights like to her hair, some to her dress, to the leaves, and especially to the dewdrops. Alright, so if I had just left it alone here, if I had just left well enough alone, but no, I masked off Cara's face and then I make another big old mistake. I decide I'm going to add some splatter, some like rain splatter to this piece using white gouache. Now if I'd gotten some big white splats, that would have actually worked better. That would have added more interest, but instead it's mostly a fine mist that just kind of adds a white noise to everything. And then, you know, I could have cleaned this up digitally, but I was like, I don't know, I had a bee in my bonnet, so I normally won't do this, but I used a bunch of white gouache to just clean up the edges a bit. Actually, there wasn't anything like that wrong with the edges, and I only really did the exterior perimeter like immediately around the illustration, and I still left some spots around that because I can clean it up digitally. But I don't know, it was like bugging me and messing with like my sense of contrast. So I decided to just clean it up. So what's weirdly not shown is after the gouache, I went over it again with some of the Cambio Tambien brush pens, especially like the Indigo and the Ultramarine, just to, oh, there we go. Oh, okay, wasn't shown. Just to kind of clean things up. And I also went in with a Tombow Fudenosuke to kind of clean up some of the inking on her face. I don't know why that wasn't shown, but I just wanted to disclose that there were no issues with inking over the white gouache, no spidering, nothing went wrong. Okay, so we can paint over the Cambio Tambien without it resisting and without it reactivating, both of which are really important and great, and they don't reactivate even with loads of water on top of it, which is also excellent. So, what's the verdict on the Kuretake Cambio Tambien brush pens? Well, the pros are, they are available in colors other than black. The palette would match most of the work you might wish to ink. Water and alcohol ink proof. Does not create a resist when watercolor is applied on top, so you can layer watercolor on top of ink. And nylon bristles provide a nice inking experience. The cons? You can't really control the ink flow by squeezing the body, which is just like a whoa for these kind of brush pens. These pens are drippy and may put down too much ink and the ink flow may blob out of the pen. They are difficult to draw small areas considering this ink flow. They are somewhat pricey, but so are the Pentel Pigment Brushpens. Haven't run out of it yet, so I don't know. And I haven't seen refills for these available in the US. I don't even know if you can refill them because the back half doesn't seem to unscrew, or if it does unscrew, it's going to take a lot more force than I'm willing to give for now, not knowing whether or not they're supposed to unscrew or not. So I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and informative. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below. And I hope you guys have a wonderful